that is a healthy hive will produce a lot of honey. You can use it to help out other hives by brood. You can use it to, if you'd like to raise queens, and also eventually, depending on how many bees you want, you can do splits with a healthy hive. So let's go to the next one. So what I'd like to do is just kind of go through a process. So what I've, again, tried to do is simplify it and come up with a quick way to assess how well your hive is doing. So the first would be an external inspection. So you're looking at the traffic. So it's subjective. So in the picture, to me, that's a high level of traffic. Each hive is different, but that's something to mark down. And if there's any other lazy note takers like myself, a good way to take notes is just to use your smartphone and take pictures, because it already saves the location and the time and date. So any questions so far about traffic and how to assess traffic? No? Okay. So the next thing to look for in your traffic is to see if your bees are bringing in any pollen. And if your bees are bringing in pollen, that's typically a pretty good sign that your colony is still queen right. Even if it has low traffic, I found that if the bees are bringing in pollen, even with a small population, that there's typically a good laying queen in that colony. And then most important is assessing how many actual frames of bees you have. So in this picture, I would say, not getting into fractions, I would say that that's 6 healthy frames of bees. So again, what I'm suggesting is that you first want to, if you have a small population of bees, the first thing that you want to do is try to sandwich all of the eggs, larvae, and brood to one side of your box. And the reason that you're doing that is you're trying to conserve with this arrangement the brood temperature. So if you look at the picture on the left, the ELB is eggs, larvae, and brood. And I typically would place that nearest to the entrance, and then you follow that by any frames that you have that have food and pollen, and then after that, empty frames. And for, these are just examples of eggs, larvae, and brood. So on the left, those are eggs, obviously, with the capped brood down below. In the middle, that's larvae at different ages, and then I think you can see some eggs at the bottom. One thing to note, and it's at least on my side, the quality is not that great, but a good way to judge the health of the brood is if it's shiny and if they're sort of floating in food. So if you see that, that's a good sign that your bees are being well fed. And then to the picture on the right is just a picture of eggs. And then the next slide is a slide of what you should see on a frame with food stores. So the yellow is obviously pollen, and then the uncapped substance is nectar, and then the capped substance is honey. Oops. So typically, I would do an assessment between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. because most of the foragers are out, and it's easier to work with your bees during that time period. Again, asking yourself the question, do you see the bees returning to the hive with pollen? And then my procedure would be gently smoke across the entrance. Remove the top of the hive and count the number of frames of bees. And also very important is what's the hive smell like? Because a good healthy hive should smell like beeswax and honey. Also look for eggs, larvae, and brood and food stores. And if, again, instead of rummaging through your entire hive looking for the queen, if you see eggs, larvae, and brood, 99% of the time the queen's going to be in there. And if you have eggs, larvae, and brood, even if you have a small population of bees, there are ways to, and which I'll touch on later, there are ways to help that colony. Also, look at the behavior. You know, how are the bees moving on the frames? Are they agitated? Are they aggressive? Or are they just sort of there and not moving very much? And probably most important is look for signs of pests, especially this time of year. Varroa is really starting to increase. So I definitely suggest to everyone, if you have a failing hive or any hive this time of year, treat your hive. So again, my hope is that by having these meetings every 2 weeks, I'd like to encourage the conversation with everyone to come together and talk about different issues that they see in their colonies, and hopefully together and collectively we can come up with some helpful suggestions that help improve everybody's hive health going into the fall. Because the one thing is that if you don't build up your population during the summer, your bees will typically start producing your winter bees in late summer. And if you don't have a good summer population, you're not going to have a good winter population. And then obviously if you don't have a good winter population, your hive will crash on you. So in this system, I'm suggesting that if you have a weak colony that you're trying to revive, feed it. Again, all of these steps are measurable. So if you start off feeding 1-to-1 sugar water, don't start with a 2-gallon feeder and fill it to the brim if you only have 4 frames of bees. Give the bees very little. You can go with something as high tech as a mason jar with a hole in the lid, and that's a good way to measure how much of the syrup is being consumed. And then when you do a more in-depth inspection, you should actually see that the bees are using some of that, and you should also see that there's an increase in comb development, and hopefully that will encourage the queen to lay more. You can also feed pollen sub to the bees, which is really helpful to encourage brood production. The only problem personally that I've ever had with pollen patties is that no matter how small I try to make the patties, the beetles and the ants get to them before the bees do. And just going down the list, check your feed every week to make sure that they have a continuous supply of food, and then inspect your growth every 2 weeks. So just to make an example, let's assume that you have 4 frames of bees. By the end of the 30 days, you should have at least another frame and a half of bees. There's also ways, if you, I wasn't sure how many people or how many colonies you actually have, but there's a lot of talk about leveling out the strength of all of your colonies, so you don't have one really strong hive and one really weak hive, that you try to make all the hives around the same number of bees. So that helps later on in the summer as we get into the dearth. It helps to prevent robbing, so your strawing bees aren't robbing out your wig bees. Let's see. So, any questions about what I've mentioned so far, or?
There actually is a question in the chat. He asked what to do to treat Versa mites, and can he get it locally or just on e-commerce?
I use Apivar, and Apivar is available from Better Bee, Man Lake, Dedant. They all sell it, and I think the smallest quantity you can get is the 10-pack, and depending on how many frames of brood you have in your hive, it will either be one or two strips.
I ordered some Apivar this morning, or this afternoon, actually, when we got home. And I've ordered from Better Bee. I've kind of stayed away from Man Lake because they just seem to have some delivery problems.
Yeah, and not to make a plug for Better Bee, but if you don't have a pesticide applicator's license, they will not ask you for one. Whereas Man Lake sometimes will ask you for your applicator's permit.
Right.
When's the latest you would recommend doing splits?
It really depends on what you see in your own apiary. I mean, do you still see drones?
Yeah.
And in personal experience, I really haven't had much success with getting queens successfully mated past July. So I would say this is the last month. And again, this isn't scientific. This is just the experience that I've had this year, be it swarms or be it splits that I've tried to make and have the split produce their own queen. I've had lots of difficulties this year getting successfully mated queens.
And
Or
I
if
think
that could be because of the weather that we've been having, where it's been really hot and then really cold and then really hot.
Yeah.
I think the general thinking is that June is kind of the end of it, or the early part of July. Much past that, like you say, Arthur, you're not going to have much success trying to do splits.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it later if you're buying queens, but again, that's an investment, and that's, if you're trying to do beekeeping on the cheap, I would say this is the last month to try to split your hives.
We prefer to call it economy beekeeping.
Oh, I'm sorry, economy beekeeping or frugal beekeeping.
Yeah.
Or we'll call it GBA economy class.
There you go.
Is anyone currently experiencing problems with their hives?
No, mine have been going like gangbusters. I got some buckfast, and they're doing wonderfully well. I've got, I don't know, 7 or 8 swarms this year, and they've all done great. I did get a swarm that was in a water meter just last week, and there was probably a total of 200 bees in this thing. But apparently they needed to get rid of it because the water meter wouldn't read the meter with the bees in it. And they were probably the nicest bees I've ever, I picked up the whole swarm in one hand, and they were climbing all over, and it was no big deal. So I'm not hopeful for this swarm, but
did you have a student?
Yes, I did have a suit on. And I didn't knock it out of the tree. It was already on the ground.
You had a question?
Oh, I was saying, yeah, I picked up some hives from Almaden Valley from a beekeeper, and they are full of hive beetles.
Oh.
And I'm like, oh shit, I brought you home. So I put out some hive cloths. I put cloths in the hives, and we'll just see. We'll just see what happens. Hopefully they don't spread out.
Did you get the little trapping boxes you can put in the bottom?
No, you know what I use? I use the little cloths that you cut squares out, and you put them in the corners of the brood chamber box, and then they get the larvae and stuff get stuck in there, and then either I pull them out or the bees will pull them out and toss them out too. But yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I have a hive that's not doing really well, and I'm worried that by the end of August, if they're not producing in a super, that they may not make it through winter. There's actually 2 nooks in the deep hive, and the brood isn't really there. We've seen the queen. I don't know if she's just ailing or not quite sure what to do with that hive. My other 2, they're just booming. That's just my wild card there.
So what would you like to do with the hive?
Well, I'm still feeding. I'm trying to get. I'm hoping that they're going to produce another queen if this one's not working. We have seen some queen cells. Nothing's happened yet. We check them every week. So don't know quite what else to do for them.
So how many boxes do you have for that particular hive?
2. The main hive, and then we put another one on, hoping that they're producing more. But like I said, when I go to look for brood, there's only actually 1 frame that has a good amount of brood on it. Eggs are sparse.
But you have 2 other hives that are doing really well, you said?
Yeah, they're doing great. They're doing great.
Because what you could do is just consolidate. So just go back down to the 1 box and add some brood from the other hives into the box that's not doing too well.
Oh, okay.
Because if you're talking about deep frames of brood, a deep frame of capped brood represents about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of bees.
Okay.
So that's quite a boost if you have a small population of bees.
Okay.
I was gonna say, did you check if you can see can you see the eggs, and can you see, is it 1 egg or is it 2? Because then you've got a different problem.
Oh no, it's been 1. It's been 1 egg. Yeah.
1 egg per cell. Okay. Yeah. Then I would do what Arthur says, and that's what I've done is pulled a frame from a stronger hive. I first make sure your strong hive has a few frames of brood.
Yeah.
And try to pull the frame that has different stages of eggs, larvae, and capped, and then you can put that in there and see if that helps.
If that helps. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Make sure the frame that you pull doesn't have the queen on it.
Oh no.
Go ahead, Charles.
So do all bees lay eggs?
No, usually only the queen will lay eggs.
But the worker bees can lay eggs too, but they lay sterile eggs, which means that they will only produce drones. Those are the male bees. And if that happens, then you've got a bigger problem. You no longer have a healthy hive.
But why don't the drone bees make the hive healthy?
Because they anyone else want to get that one? I lost my thought. The-
Why don't the drone, is your question, why don't the drone bees make the hive healthy?
yes. Oh,
They-
okay.
Drone bees are helpful, but you also need worker bees.
I was going to channel Rourke with my answer.
Oh,
So the drones are the male bees, and their only purpose is to mate with the virgin queens to give her enough inside her so she can produce fertile eggs, which then make more honeybees, female honeybees. And 95% of the hive is all female bees, and they do all the work. So the drones help make the hive healthy, but only for a short period of time.
Do you want to say thank you?
Thank you.
Hey, yeah. So I had a question about your presentation, because earlier you were talking about the configuration of your box, your brood chamber, probably, if you're starting off with that. And you mentioned that you want eggs, larvae, and brood on one particular side to regulate the temperature, and then food and pollen next to that, and empty frames. Would you recommend follower boards, and how would you go about doing that to make sure that there is an empty space depleting from the temperature of the brood?
if you have follower boards, I would say leave, depending on how many frames of bees you're starting with, but after your food frames, put in one empty frame or a frame with built-out comb, and then your follower board.
So follower boards, I mean, can be helpful if you're starting off with a smaller population of bees and then slowly kind of move it to the outside.
Right. They're very helpful in helping, again, conserve the brood temperature, because high and low temperatures outside of the hive, the bees are always trying to maintain a constant brood temperature of around 95 degrees. So whatever you can do to save them that energy is very helpful. I mean, that's one of the reasons that during the summer, bees have shorter lifespans. I was reading an article the other day that was saying that worker bees can, outside of the hive, live anywhere from 15 to 38 days during the summer months. So that being said, you need a hive that's producing a lot of workers to make it into the fall well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Question: when do hives tend to peak in this part of the world if they're feeding on natural, not people's front yards, sources? It's known what native plant trees tend to be the last meaningful food source in the area. Is it known, rather, what native plants or trees tend to be the last meaningful food sources in this area?
I don't think there's one. Have you heard of a definitive guide to plants?
No, it's hard because we're of our area. We're different than
Right.
the East Coast and the Midwest, because we're in California. We kind of have a food source all year round. That's why we have, agriculture here all year round. However, if you're in urban city areas, then your food source definitely dwindles. But it's going to cycle. But we do have dearths. I would say, I mean, as beekeepers, right? They start to overwinter in August. So that is generally when the food sources dwindle. So you just have to figure out what's growing there.
Yeah, and also this year, for colonies that overwintered well, I would say they probably reached a maximum population probably in March, April, and because that's when I started seeing a lot of swarming, and there were some pretty large swarms this year.
Huge swarms. Huge swarms.
Yeah.
But in terms of practices to use over the
Yeah.
year, I'd suggest going to our YouTube channel, looking at Sharon McRae's presentation, because she did year-round plants in that presentation. If that's what you want to be looking for. The point is, you're not going to be able to, in your backyard or in your neighborhood, to produce enough material or enough plant material to support your bees. So you need to think about the overall landscape of the area that you live in.
I know was asking the question about what's natural, but a good dearth detector is a hummingbird feeder. If your bees are swarming your hummingbird feeder, then they're definitely running out of things to forage on.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I would put a caveat on that, because we used to always have them when we had the vertical bottles with the little flowers hanging off the bottom. When we got rid of those and got the flat surface ones, we don't get the bees at all anymore because they can't get to the food. So
Yeah.
that's not quite as good a guide as it used to be. But if you
So
have
don't buy the fancy feeders.
if you have the vertical bottles with the little flowers that stick in there, or fake flowers, and they're on those, that's a good indicator. If you have the very flat surface ones where the birds have to come and they can't actually land, they just have to fly and go in vertically, then that's not a good indicator anymore, because the bees can't get to those feeders. I guess my other comment would be, you really should start thinking, if you're going through your boxes, look and see how much honey's in there, but also be starting to think about feeding. But at the same time, be thinking about, we're on the front edge of robbing season, because as the dearth comes in, the bees are going to start robbing each other. And last year, that was a big problem. And the other problem you're going to see is yellow jackets. I'm starting to see a lot more yellow jackets in back, hanging around the water sites, hanging around the plants. So pretty soon they're going to start looking. And normally in the early parts of the year, they're looking they're looking for meat. So they're looking to, so if you have your yellow jacket feeders on, you put hamburger or something in, you'll get a lot of yellow jackets. But as we go into the fall, late summer and fall, you're going to have the yellow jackets looking for sugar. So they're going to be in there trying to rob the hives as well. That was a big problem for me last year. A lot of robbing. And the yellow jackets will kill your hives to get to the food.
Yeah. Rather quickly also, I might add.
Yes.
Yeah, another pest to be aware of during the summer months are ants, because ants can really take down a hive quickly.
So what are you using to treat?
I'm sorry?
What are you using to treat for ants?
Oh, I just try to keep the hives off of the ground. Some of the stands are sitting in cups that I fill with a little soapy water, or sometimes it's just oil and water.
Yeah.
And that provides a barrier so the ants can't cross it.
One of the things I've been doing is using Terro, Terro. I take, because you get these little flat capsules, and they have the way they're designed is they have an entrance for the ants, but then it narrows down enough that the bees can't get in there.
Yeah.
So I take those packets and I put them actually on top of the inner cover on my telescoping covers, and that seems to really knock down the ants, because they seem to, on my hives, even though I've got stands, they still seem to get up, and I find a lot of them around the inside cover. So I don't know if I'm sure they're probably working their way down, but they seem to like to come in that way. And the Terro will help control them.
For what it's worth, I don't have that many hives, so I put them on a post, and And then I put tanglefoot. I use it for the fruit trees as well because the ants will form the aphids in the fruit trees. And that tanglefoot right around the base doesn't have to come up very high. And because we don't get any rain, it seems to last all summer. And it acts as a pretty effective barrier for the Argentinian black ants. And it tends to keep them out. And I don't end up with a ton of bees stuck to it or anything like that.
Oh, good, good. Because one of the complaints I hear about tanglefoot is if it's a windy day and you got a lot of dust and dirt, the dust and dirt will blow up and it tends to make it less effective. Have you
That's
found
true.
that?
Yeah, no, that's right. If you if when I go out there, I just take a stick and I just kind of rub the stuff around again, and then it's sorted.
Okay, that's good feedback.
Well, do we have any more questions for our speaker tonight, or is the presentation part of the meeting concluded?
Yeah, I'm finished with that. Is there anything that people would like to see if we continue this? Any suggestions?
So one suggestion I wanted to make was that there are a number of really good programs out there that have been presented. Auburn Bee Lab in Alabama has a whole series of stay-at-home beekeeping programs, and they have some really nationally known speakers that are quite good. So I'm kind of hoping if we do this every 2 weeks, that what we can do is re-show some of these because they make them publicly available and on Facebook and other mediums, and we could watch those and use them as a baseline for discussion. So I'd like to try that in 2 weeks. I'd like to try to do one of those presentations. Jamie Ellis, who's the main professor at University of Florida, and he's also taken over as a presenter or as a resource at Bee Culture Magazine as kind of the research guy to answer questions. He has a real nice presentation that he does as part of these stay-at-home classes. So perhaps we can do that. Or Arthur, do you have another class that you want to do in this series or that you're going to present?
Again, if there's a subject that I can mess up, then I'm happy to do it.